Hello everyone. After a period of absence due to personal commitments, I'm back to bring you the next installments of Warhammer 40K. Terminator Armor is not named so lightly, for the wearers of such revered pieces of Waka are exactly that, Terminators. The wearers of Terminator Armor are the elite fighters of any Space Marine chapter. They are veteran Marines who have displayed such courage or skill that they are deemed worthy to be fitted with a suit of Terminator Armor, comprising a composite of ceramite and plasteel built around an adamantium exoskeleton. Terminator Armor is immensely powerful, but it is also heavy and extremely difficult to use. These negative traits often a trade-off for the sheer defensive and offensive power of Terminator Armor. Its outer plating so thick and strong that it makes its wearer to all general purposes invulnerable, and its structure allowing it to be fitted with some of the heaviest weaponry available to individual Space Marines. Only Dreadnoughts and Centurions can carry equally powerful wargear. With all armor worn by Space Marines, it's important to understand that it is a form of power armor, and by that what we really mean is powered armor. Both ordinary power armor and Terminator Armor contain massive bundles of artificial fiber muscles that are neurologically driven by the wearer. The only way that humans are able to use such tools is through the use of something known as the Black Carapace. It's basically the cybernetic neurological interface that you see is implanted in the skin of a Space Marine. It's also one of the gene seed organs implanted into Space Marines. What the Black Carapace does is it enables Marines to use their power armor as almost a second skin. It gives them very high levels of maneuverability. During the Great Crusade, the Proto-Imperium of the Emperor and the Mechanicum were working through developing continually new iterations of armor. Early Terminator Armor became seen that it would eventually reach a new level of design, and it would fully replace power armor for the Astartes. The idea being that the Space Marines would primarily be more like an extremely heavy, blunt force traumator than a surgical scalpel. But one significant issue preventing this early on was it is very difficult for the Imperium to produce from both a technological and resource standpoint. The raw materials required to produce even one suit of Terminator Armor are prohibitively challenging. And this was even before the following millennia of darkness have been possible had the Emperor and his rational thinking been allowed to continue, and had the human civilization not chosen to partially destroy itself. But they did, and so after the heresy, mankind would descend into the stagnant, ignorant state in forced religious worship. Not to mention it would also just periodically lose or have knowledge stolen from it. And the Mechanicus, the most commonly seen and iconic Terminator armor, is the Indomitus pattern. And while this is generally used by most chapters, some of the founding chapters may still have relic armor from their heresy, or before. It is unusual, but not impossible that a successor chapter would also have such ancient armor, like Tartarus, Gorgon, or Cataphracti Terminator armor. Other designations, such as the Custodes and Grey Knights, have their own versions. When is Aegis respectively. Powered armor, though, doesn't specifically require a Black Carapace, or indeed any neurological interface, in order for a human to use it. Now, the exact way in which a user operates all of its functions is not entirely clear. One thing that does have to happen, though, is that the armor has to be appropriately scaled. You, for example, couldn't just put on a Space Marine's power armor, because your body would be too physically small. You could, though, wear a suit that has been appropriately scaled down for use by, say, the Serratus, the Inquisition, or even rogue traders. And these suits are usually somewhat lighter in protection, but this is balanced by the maneuverability gained by the wearer. For the specialist units like the Sororitas, they will train extensively in their armor, and so despite not having the cybernetic interface of the Astartes, they can fight just as well. And remember that while the Imperium cannot just necessarily invent things, they are able to adapt and use what they already know. So taking something that exists and just slightly scaling it down is very much within their capabilities. The only problem with this is that the non-Astartes humans are not neurologically linked to the suit, so there's no way for them to gain the benefits that Space Marines have in terms of movement and other processes provided by the armor itself. For an ordinary human, it's more like a cumbersome exoskeleton. It also wouldn't provide any sensory information directly into the wearer. While human wearers of power armor and are sent to wear such armor for the units which require them, Terminator armor is far less common. A complete rarity, in fact, that while it's known that some members of the Inquisition, usually the Audio Malleus, have worn or, 0534, wear Terminator armor, it's highly questionable how useful this would actually be in the second chapter of the series. Revelations, we see Inquisitor Sabbath. He'll get into a suit of Terminator armor, where she then proceeds to fight some lab coat tests of all things. Moreover, though, she's able to seemingly run and fight as normal, which is just not accurate at all, as to our understanding of ordinary humans and power armor. Not to mention Terminator armor itself. Because yes, even though an ordinary human male or female could certainly use Terminator armor, this would really be little more than standing in your own personal bunker, than actually having a very practical role as a piece of equipment, because the limitations will be so severe in terms of mobility, not to mention that the movement itself is known to be something that's only handled with skill by the most veteran space cranes. So while it has been known, and it is possible, the likelihood of any ordinary humans, or even Inquisition wearing Terminator armor to any real positive effect, is just very unlikely. 0537. Another reason why Terminator armor became less popular, replacing power armor, which continued to be developed and improved, was the exploitation of Terminator armor during and after the heresy. Now up until this time, it had still been expected that Terminator armor would become a slow but natural progression for Marines as their primary fighting armor, but during the emergence of the Traitors, soon we would see Space Marine fighting Space Marine, which would subsequently highlight a major problem for Terminator armor. Because despite its bulk and powerful strengths to enable it to withstand massive firepower, its lack of mobility, combined with the inherent weakness in all power armor, being of course the joints, which requires a degree of mobility, it meant that this could be more easily exploited from precise shots or close-quarter melee, but especially by those who had learned where their very best place to exploit these chinks in the seemingly impregnable armor would be. So then what you would see would be traitor Marines wearing ordinary power armor that was simply able to outmaneuver the bulkier armor of Terminators and basically run rings around them. So while it still has its role to play, it was decided that given the turn of events that had occurred, it was no longer a practical plan to equip all the Astartes, the Tactical Dreadnought. It has become especially useful in fighting more instinct-driven species like tyranny and orcs, all those who prefer to not get their hands dirty, like the Tau. Now in the future, with the Primaries and Belisarius Call, it's possible that this concept could continue to move forward. In fact, it is known that Call studied under the Emperor himself, and was even responsible, at least in part, for the development of the Black Carapace. Call has since seemingly forgotten how this was possible in the modern age. However, one could speculate that if he achieved this once, he could do so again, and if he were able to develop a more widespread system of neurological interface, this could enable ordinary humans to have much wider access to scaled-down armor types. Now in that situation, this is when you could see the emergence of, say, Imperial Guard officers, important battlefield units wearing power armor, and certainly more widely in the Inquisition. The idea, though, of replacing existing armor has really been retired, though, at this point, because many of the fighting systems and tactics of the Astartes are so refined, and by now, already many other specialized types of suits coming into use. It's unlikely that they would return to the archaic concept of slow, bulky sledgehammers. In fact, you only have to look at the development of the Centurion armor to see that the Adeptus Astartes have begun to move on from the concept of widespread Terminator armor usage. Centurion's armor was developed during the Age of Apostasy by the Mechanicus, and during this time, the Mechanicus was scouring the galaxy, as it continues to today, for fragments of STC data. And around this earlier period, though, they had more success and some of their discoveries could not be replicated, or were beyond the ability of the tech priests to be able to adapt them for use. But the material that they could use, among other things, enabled them to develop the Centurion armor. Now, unlike Terminator armor, the Centurion is more like a battlesuit, encasing around the power armor of the Space Marine, and becomes more like a walking vehicle, since your suits are also said to have a machine spirit, not dissimilarly to Sail and Raiders or other powerful pieces of tech like Titans and Lights. When it comes to Terminators, so the Astartes have now deemed it necessary to adapt their role and tactics to compensate for its shortcomings. In the past, Terminators would be just left to sort themselves out, but now they can often be supported by other Astartes, with one balancing out the other shortcomings, Terminators providing heavier firepower, and the Marines wearing standard armor, providing more maneuverable defenses for them. And while Terminator armor is feared by their chapters, also just known to be very, very valuable, it's difficult to produce technologically and just in terms of resources. And for this reason, considerable effort will be given to recovering fallen Terminator armor. In battle, not dissimilarly, but not as much as, say, a Titan falling, and the recovery of the Princeps. The rarity, though, is not the only reason for the extreme length it will be given to recovering suits of Terminator armor. Another reason is the mark worn on all left shoulder plates by Terminators, the Crux Terminators, and the Crux Terminators from places where the ordinary chapter identify would be, because it holds special significance. And that significance is not limited to simply the fact that the spaceman wearer has been deemed worthy to operate such a revered relic of Imperial hardware. Because it is said that the Crux Terminators contains a small shard of the Emperor's own power armor, that the Emperor's armor was melted down after he was interred into the Golden Throne, and it is said that this may give, whereas some holy protection, and enable its wearer to survive damage that would likely be beyond what even you would expect the Terminator to survive from. Now, while there is likely some element of truth to this, it seems probable that only a few Terminators in the modern age would actually likely have any crux which still contains such an element, unless they've been keeping a special container somewhere on Mars or Terra for this sole purpose, and they've been rationing it with very expert skill. The truth, though, is that they simply wouldn't have been enough of the Emperor's own armor, huge as it was, to have been able to distribute it in such a way across all the Terminators that are and have existed in the past 10,000 years. In the modern Imperium, though, even for Astartes themselves, this belief in the power of the Emperor to provide people with some kind of holy shield is not entirely without demonstrable evidence. However, it also seems likely that there is possibly some other explanation to the crux, and this idea about having protective power. We know that other marks and sigils have actual technological power. A chaplain's rose areas, for example, contains powerful shielding. Given the look of the crux, it seems very reasonable to assume they operate in a similar way, and that perhaps in the Imperium for the Terminators, because of their fearful and revered status, it suits the believers of the Emperor and the Ecclesia key better to describe how Terminators are saved by the power of the Emperor, rather than some technological system. This, after all, has become the very doctrine of the Imperium. Reject science, put your faith in the Emperor. So it's entirely understandable how such a tale about the crux could become so widely believed. Now usually, all chapters' first company will have Terminators, but often only an original founding chapter will have a large amount of Terminator units. Second founding successor chapters will often have considerably less. The thing is that the true skill word Terminator AMA is less about fighting skill, although of course that's always expected from veteran Marines. Terminator armor, primarily because of its bulk, is more about the skill to move in any coherent, reasonable way without just falling over. Terminators are usually implemented for extremely dangerous close-quarter environments, where normal guardsmen, or even say a space marine, could fall foul of an enemy, stepping out from a narrow hiding place and blasting them in the back with a powerful point-blank shot. Now granted, even standard spaceplane armor is strong, but dependent on the type of enemy, or just how much the Marines were open to tolerating such a risk, Terminators might be employed, and that is because the armor, to all but the most extreme of threats, is lion vulnerable. Terminators can be deployed physically to battle by, say, a Land Raider or a Storm Raven, but Terminators are often a deep strike weapon. What this means is that unlike most Marines, they're able to use the ability of teleportation. As with many systems used by the Imperium, this actually utilizes the warp itself. And while using the warp is always dangerous, It's generally considered that this is an acceptable risk. It's a trade-off, it's not especially safe, but the benefits are very high. So while teleportation is achieved via machines, it's essentially a psychic power. This teleportation is usually enhanced by a homing beacon, placed by scouting units as necessary. Teleporting without a homing beacon is possible, but it can lead to any number of problems, such as materializing as a scattered unit, or inside of an object. Although apparently Imperial teleportation units do have systems in place to prevent this from being fatal. Teleportation enables Terminators to strike at the very heart of enemy battle lines, and this causes absolute chaos, or even can trigger the collapse of enemy command and turn a battle. Because having 5 or 10 invulnerable killing machines appear out 1400 of nowhere, who then proceed to begin absolutely shredding your own guys, is generally going to have that kind of effect. The Terminator squad, when fighting alone in a deep strike situation, or say within a space hulk, exterminating hordes of Xena's tyranny, will have to share tactical information. The armor itself has any number of sensory systems that feed back to their helmets, which themselves contain significant data collection tools. They can share live video feed with each other, and through the Black Carapace 1426, their own senses are fed with the collective information, and this will help to limit the chances of them being fatally caught unaware. It's unknown just how much of this can be attributed to the original standard template design from the dark age of technology. But considering that the original armored suit was designed as a heavy repair suit, potentially for having to repair critically damaged systems in extremely hazardous conditions, the mass sensor collection system and data feed sharing would play a large part in the original 1452 design of the armored unit. Now, in addition to the protective suit itself, Terminators can wield a terrifying array of firepower, much of which is usually limited to being mounted on vehicles. The standard issue for them is a storm bolter and a power fist, and this gives a Terminator strong stopping power and crippling close-quarter capability against any foe. But upgraded units may be given a chained fist, which is pretty much as it sounds. It's typically as unpleasant as all chained weapons are. Heavier ranged weapons can include assault cannons and heavy flamers, both devastating weapons for an individual to wield. The most powerful piece of ranged wargear is known as the Cyclone Missile Launcher, which is a personal missile system mounted atop of the Terminator, and it's reminiscent of that used on Imperial Knights, and even titles for close-quarters Terminators can also use lightning claws and power swords to literally shred their enemies, and they may often be seen also wielding a thunder hammer and storm shield combination to grind their enemies into the dirt. Despite its various shortcomings within the modern Imperium, Terminator armor is still the definitive personal armor in terms of defensive strength. While standard power armor continues to improve with the development of Primaries armor variants, the most comparable to Terminator on being the Mark X Gravis heavy armor. But Terminator armor is still the most personally durable for an individual. This is of course still a trade-off for its limited movement. It's possible they may still achieve their goal of retrofitting their entire force. Perhaps not literally with Terminator armor as it is seen today, but with some variation which balances the trade-off and minimizes limitations for the wearer. But then equally, nothing may ever be quite as tough as Terminator armor itself. But the development of other techs such as Centurion armor does make them look ever more archaic. However, the ability to deep strike and teleport into the enemies of mankind still makes them a terrifying force that none would want to face. Near-invincible killing machines who would break you in half if you weren't cut to pieces in the first seconds. Terminators, if nothing else, remain a devastating tool for bludgeoning enemy morale in a siege battle. They also remain the preferred suit of the Grey Knights, who have to deal with incomprehensibly horrific enemies. For all the tools that exist for the modernist artificer, it would be fair to say the Terminators remain the sledgehammer of the Imperium.